don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. Hello again, and thanks for listening. I hope you're well. We here at Thought Stretchers Education are in full swing with summer professional development. We had our PBL Grow 24 event recently. We are looking forward to a busy July and August and fall, where we'll be doing lots of work on project-based learning and differentiated instruction and inquiry and some other things as well. I would encourage you to visit our website, which is wegrowteachers.com, and it has all of our professional development offerings, including those that I mentioned. And I'd also like to mention our objective pluralism work for those of you who are school leaders or working in the ecosystem of education and might be struggling with some of the culture war kind of things that are really putting pressures on our schools. You can find a few blog pieces and our objective pluralism workshop in the menu at wegrowteachers.com. In this episode, I spoke with Carl Hendrick. I was really looking forward to this conversation, and it didn't disappoint. Carl is the co-author of How Teaching Happens and How Learning Happens with Paul Kirshner and one other on one of those books. And they have a new update, so we discussed some of that, but then we really got into the weeds on some of the complexities and nuances of science of learning and knowledge and the role of direct instruction and inquiry in ways that I really appreciated. Carl has deep expertise in the science of learning and is a professor of education. So it was great to be in conversation with him, especially as it seems like so many of these conversations become adversarial and unnecessarily black and white, and that is not productive for our students and the advancement of teaching and learning. With all of that said, it should come as no surprise that this conversation is one of my favorites that I've been able to have on this podcast, and that says a lot because I've had some really great ones. And here's that conversation with Carl. I'm here with Carl Hendrick, who is a professor at a university that I have a really hard time pronouncing it, at Academica University of Applied Sciences. And I think I'm hopefully close, but he's probably going to do a better job of explaining that. I want to give you an opportunity to say hello and introduce yourself, kind of give a little background on what you do and anything that you think is relevant to the conversation that we're going to have about your work and some of the updates and all that good stuff.
Thank you very much, Drew. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you. I was a teacher, an English teacher for about 16 years. I worked for 6 years in an inner city London, I guess what you'd call a public school. Mm-hmm. I then I'd done a master's degree in modern literature, and then I decided to do a PhD in education, in English education at King's College in London. And I went and worked in the polar opposite of that, which is an independent school, private school, just outside London to get some data. And I ended up working there for about 10 years. I ended up doing various things there in the field of bridging the gap between research and practice. I then wrote a book in 2017 with Robin McPherson called What Does This Look Like in the Classroom?, where we essentially took classroom questions from classroom teachers and put them to experts that we could find. People like Dylan William, and one of them was Paul Kirshner, mm-hmm. That's how I met him. And then soon after that, he asked me to write a book with him. And then I wrote another book, actually writing a third book now. And then I finished my PhD and I left to work at Academica University in Amsterdam, and my main job now is working with teachers and school leaders who are interested in evidence, interested in what we might broadly term the science of learning, finding some cognitive science, cognitive psychology, and I do some writing and researching, and that's where I'm at now.
Right. In the books that you have written with Paul, and we're going to talk about the updates to at least one of them, How Teaching Happens and then How Learning Happens, of which, as I think you're aware, I talked with Paul on this podcast when those books came out, and recommend them to folks because they're really quite well done and a great resource for teachers to use. If you said this, I apologize. When you taught, what were your subjects that you taught?
So I taught English literature,
Okay,
like a secondary level, so 14 to 18.
gotcha. Okay, and what was your PhD in?
That was in English education, so in the field of social science. But that was looking at really talk in English education in 4 different case studies.
Okay. Okay, and one last question, just to give some context, because I think it sometimes can be really sort of insightful, is how would you describe your pre-university schooling? Was it more traditional, less traditional? What was that like growing up?
Yeah. I had, again, a very dual experience. So my primary education was kind of like a mixed school, no uniform, pretty kind of middle of the road, but there was a lot of focus on poetry, which I liked. The secondary school I went to a Christian Brothers Catholic secondary school, which I didn't like, but I learned a lot. um, and that was at kind of the same time where I was finding out who I was. So I was kind of coming up against a lot of things that were that I didn't like, and then I left that school when I was 16, and I went to, I guess you'd call it high school, to another school that was the opposite of that, which was kind of, again, no uniform, mixed, very progressive, and I had a great time, but I didn't learn anything. And then but basically after that, I was a musician. So I just wanted to play music. So I did that for years, and ended up signing a record deal and touring and doing all that kind of stuff. So did that for years, and then we got dropped by the label, and then I went back to university. My plan was to sort of still be an artist as such and to write a novel. And my plan was, okay, I'll go back to university and then I'll just find out about the greats. I just thought I need to kind of, immerse myself in the greats. So I spent 3 years, amazing 3 years, just studying literature. And then after that, I got a place at King's College, amazingly, to do teacher training. And then, I thought, well, I need to earn money while I'm writing this great novel. And then I was teaching. And then I felt like that was something that was great. And then I wanting to write or wanting to be a novelist was something that I wanted to want rather than I wanted, if that makes sense. So I liked the idea of it. I had a romantic notion of, writing a novel. What I realized was, and this is true, I think, of, when I met people who were novelists, they just get up and they just write every day, whether they feel like it, whether they want to do it. They just grind it out every day, and they're actually driven to do it. Like, they feel, right, I'm going to sit down. For me, that process was sort of tortuous. Like, it wasn't, I just was like, I wanted to want to be that, and I wasn't really that. So I had to come to terms with realizing, this teaching thing, like, I think I can do something there. And that's the way it went. So if, a failed musician, a failed novelist, And yeah, that's where I am now.
Well, I didn't realize that you had a background in music. I do as well, and used to play in a band and recorded some myself. So now I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that. What did you play, and
Well,
what style of music?
I was the singer, guitar player. We were like a four-piece rock band.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so we signed a record deal, and then we had played in Ireland. We'd played festivals, and we played with big acts. We played with people like Joe Strummer, Paul Weller, people like that. And then the record company brought over this producer, a guy called Michael Beinhorn, who had produced, Soundgarden and Red Hot
Hmm.
Chili Peppers and Ozzy Osbourne and stuff like that. And he was amazing, but I think we were just too young, and we were too kind of, I don't think we were good enough, if I'm being honest.
Hmm.
So he was really had, super high standards, and he was used to, like, working with
Pros.
huge acts. Yeah, so the record company, I guess, took a risk. So we made this album. We demoed this album, and then the record company just decided to drop us because um they didn't want to release an album and spend money on promotional stuff, and which was, understandable. But again, that difference between what you think you want to do and what you're actually good at are two different things.
Right, right.
So
Well,
coming to terms with that is,
yeah. Well, it's funny you
yeah,
say that because I was a guitarist and singer and, wrote songs for our band, and I sometimes will say, it was a great experience, learned a lot, had some really interesting experiences playing around doing some of those same kinds of things. Doesn't sound like quite to the level that you all or attention that you had. But in the end, while there were several reasons why we didn't make it, I say, well, the lead singer and songwriting is probably the biggest reason. And
yeah,
pointing the finger at me, it's like, yeah, we were okay, we're not good or not great, we're good, not great, and it's it does take a bit of a step to say, well, maybe I'm not as good as I wanted to be, and that's
yeah.
okay. So anyways, well, we can compare albums and records and music. I don't know if you can see probably back there behind me. I've got all my guitars that I don't play much anymore, but they're there in case I ever want to get that itch. But
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So let's talk about the book. So how teaching happens and how learning happens. You have an update to that. How do you describe these books to people? Because they're definitely not novels.
Mhm.
They are very informative, but as informational text, there's lots in there. So how do you describe those books before we get to the updates?
Well, it's interesting we were talking about the music there, because that was a thing that we were thinking, Paul and I, when we wrote the book, which was what are the kind of classic albums of
Hmm.
education research? What's the Exile on Main Street? What's the Sergeant Pepper's? What are the ones that are hugely influential,
Mm-hmm.
um, and were, in some sense true, which is, I think, what great art is as well. It tells the truth.
Hmm.
Um, in fact, I had I'd had this quote in my head for years, which was Bob Dylan, three chords and the truth. And then upon researching it for this book, realized that it wasn't him that said that. He had actually taken it from somebody else, and it was actually a country singer songwriter who had said that.
Hmm.
So we basically decided, what are the seminal works from the field of cognitive psychology, education psychology, and then how can we demystify them for teachers?
Mm-hmm.
How can we take the big hitters and say, well, in 10 minutes you can read this chapter on this topic and go, okay, here's a summary of what this paper is saying, and then here's how to use it. It's difficult because in the field we're working in, it doesn't map neatly onto classic albums, because you can have an album, or let's say something like, I don't know, take Sergeant Pepper's. It's a kind of a standalone thing, whereas in the field of cognitive psychology, there's a lot more imbrication, there's a lot more overlap, there's a lot movements. There isn't like one seminal thing where there's a before and after, which I guess is also like music in a way. But So we kind of had to choose papers and articles that we felt were representative of a certain idea or a certain field. So, for example, I chose a paper by Carol Dweck on growth mindset, which I thought was an important idea around the idea of motivation. But there was probably 10 papers I could have chosen, but I, focused on that one. So then that was the first book, How Learning Happens, and that was just it. What's the basic mechanisms of how we learn, and what are the important stuff mainly for teachers to know.
Okay, and then How Teaching Happens being the second book, and that was much more difficult to write. I mean, How Learning Happens. I mean, if we take, let's say, the last 70 years of what we might call the cognitive revolution. So you have this period from about 1950, starting with people like George Miller, and he was looking at specifically the limitations of working memory, all the way up to, say, Sweller, who starts in the late 80s, and really at the turn of the century, he kind of hits his stride. And then you obviously have people like John Hattie, who are synthesizing research in the last 10 or 15 years. But all of that field, I think, is there's a lot of agreement. So there's a broad agreement, even within the field of constructivism, which we'll talk about as well, that we construct meaning ourselves, and that we understand new knowledge through old knowledge. So there's a lot of overlap between different ideas, and that was the thinking in How Learning Happens. When it came to How Teaching Happens, there's a lot less consensus. So in terms of instructional design, this is where the wheels come off it all, I think, a lot. And this is really at the heart of the argument between two schools, which is one of epistemology and one of instructional design. So there's broad consensus about the let's say, well, what Sweller calls cognitive architecture. So memory, cognitive overload. There's very few people who would disagree with that, but where the disagreement happens then is in teaching. So that was much more difficult to line up 30 seminal pieces of work in that field. And we had to be careful in doing that. Was the second book always planned while you were writing the first, or
No.
that came as a...
No, not at all. Paul wanted to write the second book, and he said, "What, How Teaching Happens," and I was, I thought it would be difficult, but we had spoken a lot about, like, one thing that we had wanted to do was to have much more practical, like if there was a weakness in the first book, I think there should have been a lot more on, like, where the rubber meets the road. Like, how do you actually use this in specific classrooms, in specific subjects, and specific age ranges? So that's why I asked my friend Jim Heal to come and write the second book with us, because Jim works for the Deans for Impact in the US, and he really does a lot of work in terms of translating a lot of the stuff. He's really good with that. So I felt he would be a good kind of addition to the team. Also, I just had twins, so I needed some help.
Yeah. So then, what I see a certain perspective and lens, and again, I have said multiple times and tried to help people understand, like, these books I think are great resources, even if I am, probably, as a way I think about it, sort of more on the spectrum of learning, more in the constructivist, progressive inquiry kinds of thinking. I think that there's significant overlap, and I'm hoping we can talk about some of those things, but the sort of tribalism that I see people engage in is, well, this is by Paul Kirshner, who is not always the most easy spoonful of sugar. I like Paul, but
That's true.
he can be a bit abrasive. And of course, then the sort of science of learning kind of advocacy or evangelists that's one side. So I see a particular sort of response to these kinds of works and these books as being not particularly positive. I'm curious how you've seen that reception. I mean, I imagine in the research ed crowd that it's quite positive, but that's not the totality.
It's probably it's like anything, Drew, isn't it? You never really, when you talk to people in person, you don't really get the same. Social media has a deranging effect on the communication and debate, and so what happens is people say things and behave in a way that they never would,
right?
In person. So I just really try to. I don't really think there's a lot to be gained from picking apart someone's idea. I mean, there's an equity issue, I think, where if someone is putting forward particular methods of instructional design that are limiting or disinhibiting certain groups of kids, then I think they should be challenged on that. And there's a big debate, I know, in the US at the minute around Joe Bowler, for example. I know that if you look at what's happening in the teaching of reading, for example, particularly in the US, there's a growing, very vocal movement, largely of parents as well, who are kind of saying, why isn't our children, why are they not being taught to read properly when we have very strong evidence to do so? So there's that on one end of the scale, but like you say, there's people who, I think where it gets really unfortunate is when people turn it into a political discussion as well. That's, I think, unhelpful. And it's interesting how research ed and those of us who are kind of interested in that field or in cognitive psychology, the amount of times we get called, right wing, this, that, and the other, which none of us are. We're all kind of we're progressive socially, and I think that's why we're interested in instructional design and methods that have a huge impact at kids that are often the most needed. So I don't really encounter a lot of it, and you get it when you're on social media, obviously. But I just don't. I don't really respond. I try to. I think, like, for your own sanity, like 20 minutes, 30 minutes on social media a day. If you're going beyond that, you're just asking for it.
That dynamic is obviously true, and I try to model and sometimes certainly fail at being less than gracious in responses or replies or quote tweets or whatever. But it is really interesting. And when I had Emily Hanford on with Natalie Wexler and a couple other folks to do a reading wars panel, one of the things we talked about, and I've talked about in ensuing podcasts that are about reading instruction in particular, is that I find it really odd that there's a sort of intermixing or there's a weird dynamic, right? I mean, Emily Hanford, if you're familiar with where her reporting is coming from, American Public Media is not at all right wing, but there is this sort of commingling or association that work or the science of learning work. I've seen less of it in my view, or from my perspective, of the science of learning being associated with that. But there is, sort of like classical education advocates who are now really leaning hard into science of learning kinds of principles. So there's a strange dynamic, and it's perplexing for some people.
It's really strange, Drew, and I find that bizarre. I mean, I think it's because certain governments have adopted or been interested. I mean, two things can be true at the same time. So you can have people or a person right on one issue and completely wrong on another issue.
Mm-hmm.
So I am no fan of the Conservative government in the UK. I think Brexit has been, particularly as someone who is an immigrant in the UK and who's married to an immigrant, I think it's just been a disaster. But I respect people's right to have an opinion on it, and to I can see the arguments.
Yeah.
But then I can see how certain people might think differently. But I think the problem is when people turn it into a moral issue, where people kind of say, well, you're a bad person because you don't want to do our way of doing things.
Yeah.
And that's just where you can have a discussion, and hopefully we will talk about the similarities and differences between the two schools. But it's when people start kind of painting you as which Tom Bennett gets a lot of. He gets a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of outright abuse, quite frankly.
Yeah.
And I think that's just doesn't really get us anywhere.
Right. Well, what are the updates to the How Learning Happens book? Let's make sure that we get that out before we get too deep in the weeds.
We felt that there needed to be more stuff on memory. So we added a first kind of section where there's 5 chapters on specifically looking at memory models, like the Badley and Hitch model, Tulving's model of episodic and semantic memory, because we sort of felt like to really understand learning, memory is really where everything is happening, and that's central to cognitive psychology. So how do we attend to new information? How do we encode it? How do we process it? How do we then retrieve it from our memory? All these things are integral to learning. So we did that, and then we did a chapter at the end on lethal mutations. So this is a kind of a developing field. We're interested in, well, how can we get this wrong? So even for and this isn't like myths like learning styles and stuff like that. This is where things like retrieval practice or dual coding or whatever it is. Let's think about how we can get this wrong and how that can be sort of thought about in a more sophisticated way. Because I think that's another problem we have, is there's such a proliferation of stuff on memory and cognitive psychology and cognitive load, and I think we could be hitting a point where a lot of it is just not being understood fully and then implemented, poorly.
Can you give me an example?
I think something like dual coding is an example. So where you have, this goes back to the work of Alan Pavio. 50 years ago, we essentially have dual channels, verbal and oral, not learning styles. So it's basically the idea that if you supplement one with the other. So if you're showing or explaining a map, a diagram can be very helpful. The visual can really complement. That's somehow transformed into people putting icons on every single resource, like everywhere, just a slide or I saw something which was it was a page from Shakespeare, but they'd put icons for nearly every 5 words. There was an icon of like a crown or a king, or and it was just really confusing. And it's the opposite of the central idea. Really, the broad idea from cognitive psychology is about the semantic meaning is the most important thing. What's the underlying meaning that you're trying to get across? And when you really pay close attention to that, then you'll remember it better. You'll be able to use it better in better contexts. So that's one example. I think retrieval practice is another. The testing effect. That's probably the most evidence thing we have from the science of learning. There's nearly over 100 years of overwhelming evidence for that. If you take learning as some sort of change in our long-term memory, then that's the most efficient way of doing that. But that's only one small part of a bigger picture, obviously. But it's hard to get it right, and you need to think about interleaving. You need to think about spacing your learning. You need to think about questions like, where do students encounter the mistakes they make? How do they encounter the mistakes they make? Even small little things that, and this is my work with teachers, like, do you phrase the question in the same way as the original content they encountered? And what's the effect of that?
Mm-hmm.
And then how often do they need to revisit that knowledge that they've had? So I often see teachers doing, they'll have a quiz every Monday or whatever it is on a topic. And then your first question is, okay, that's great. So when do they have the second quiz on that? When do they revisit that knowledge? And they go, well, they get it's retrieval practice. They have a quiz. And that's a probably poor way of implementing that, because if they're not encountering that information, numerous times, if the curriculum is not designed in such a way
Mm-hmm.
as they'll encounter that concept or that idea multiple times, then they're just doing a quiz.
Right.
It's not really, it's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
So thinking about the curriculum and how it fits into the bigger picture, then that's more important.
Yeah. Well, I think you're highlighting one of the things that I think is maybe overlooked or not talked about enough. I mean, one of the criticisms of sort of inquiry teaching is that it's very hard to do well, and I don't disagree. And I'm sympathetic to that argument, and have asked this question in conversations with folks like you, in positions of researchers and things like this. Is, if we were forced to choose whether you're just going to sort of do direct instruction and build knowledge versus, something more deep learning kinds of inquiry things, especially with a novice teacher, then which would you choose? And I think there's at least a good argument that you would choose the more direct instruction, because at least they're getting that knowledge. And if you do inquiry poorly, it could be really disastrous for students.
Yeah.
So I say all of that to say, well, one thing that I think people maybe make a mistake about or overlook is that the more science of learning approaches are not necessarily simple, right? There are lots of complexities and nuances that you're pointing out. And to be able to, I mean, you think about the average teacher and their preparation, their time to prepare, and their time to improve their craft and practice and get feedback and do all of the things that are ideals. Almost no teacher has that ideal situation. Yeah. So to be able to think that deeply about doing those things and do them well is an incredibly tall task.
You make a good point, Drew. That's a very good point. And I think that's really a justification for more investment in professional learning and particularly for beginning teachers. Really, you're talking about a 9-month period, a whistle-stop tour of stuff. I mean, the science of learning, like, let's take one thing and be specific here. Like, one of the main, let me think of a main, say checking for understanding. Mm-hmm. So that's integral to, like, the broad argument is this, okay? Instructional design must align with cognitive architecture, what we know about how we learn things. That's that's the basic argument. And so if you go down that path, then something like checking for understanding in a lesson is an incredibly nuanced, rich, powerful lever in a classroom to really drive learning. So whether you're doing in direct instruction or whether you're doing a more open-ended task, to just get a temperature check on what they know, how do they know it, and more importantly than what the teacher is going to plan next, is an incredibly powerful. There's lots of different ways of doing that, and you're right, it's not there's a bad way to do it, a really ineffective way to do it, and then there's a really effective way of doing it. And there, I think things that there's just not enough time, there's not enough thought about it, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really, I mean, I was working with a group of teachers last week, and, they were asking lots of questions about cognitive load theory and these kinds of things. And, one of the things I sort of jokingly said, but it's obviously true, is newsflash, teaching is hard. And, they sort of giggled, but it's like, how can we get closer to those ideals? So you mentioned, one of the things that with the updates is thinking about how we can get things wrong, and I'm going to guess that you didn't address this or not addressing this in the updates. But one thing that I wonder about is the sort of, as I call them, evangelists for science of learning kinds of things, or on the other side of that, the other school of inquiry, those kinds of things, where there's like, I'm going to take this and I'm going to turn the knob up to 11, right? Everything is this, and everything else is that. And we focus on this, and that is not good for kids. And it seems to me that that's a real dynamic, and I'm curious how you feel about that. If you see something similar, sort of in the sort of research ed space. I could name some names, but I'm not going to. Folks that it's like there's this, again. We talk about politicization, just sort of this us versus them tribal mindset, and I have a line of demarcation, and inquiry is bad, direct instruction is good, or vice versa, or something like that.
Yeah, I think in the spirit of science, if anyone is an evangelist, then it's really anti-science, I think, because that's the opposite of science. Science is really, we update our theories based on new evidence. And so if anyone is fundamentalist, or as you say, evangelist, then I don't think that's a good way. And also a good question to ask people is, have you changed your mind? Right. Because I think if someone has changed their mind on something, it's a good indicator that they're amenable, at least, to evidence. Dylan often talks about, I think it's from someone else, but the challenge is, can you think of one piece of evidence that you accept the truth of the finding, but you wish it weren't true? And his thing is cognitive load theory. And he thinks that, and he's also said this publicly, but I remember talking to him about this, and he was just saying, just the evidence is so strong. Yeah, the evidence is just overwhelming. And he was probably coming from a more constructivist mindset, and then updated his thinking and accommodated that and changed his thinking. He didn't become dismissive of everything else, just was kind of saying, this is really important to consider. So I think all of that stuff is unhelpful. But the thing, Drew, is you're probably, like, where are these debates happening? They're probably happening on social media. So to me, I just think straight away, there's a 4% chance that it's going to be a productive conversation, and there's an overwhelming, people are going to reply with GIFs or with glib comments or with, a completely out of context thing that you said or whatever it is. So I don't think that's particularly helpful. And like, here's the thing with all of this. Schooling and education, I mean, the learning part is just one aspect of a lot of different things. And even in a classroom, I would say, okay, if you want kids to remember stuff 6 months from now, 12 months from now, we have very strong knowledge on how to do that. But that's just one little part of the equation. Also, you have things like, how do you spark a love of Shakespeare, or how do you spark an interest in the scientific method? And those things you don't need the science of learning for. That's a different kind of thing. I often tell the story of a teacher I had who really got me thinking about classical literature. I had no interest in it, but he came and he talked about the Odyssey, and he came in and talked about Ovid's poetry, and he did it in a way that was just like it was the most important thing in the world. He did it in a way that, and he wasn't even a very good teacher, but he just was like this. He talked about it like his life depended on it, and we loved it because he loved it,
Right.
and we went along with him. And that's nothing to do with retrieval practice or interleaving or any of that stuff. That sits on top of it as well, and that's another important part of the equation to consider. So the science of learning stuff is really, for me, it's people saying, okay, kids are getting motivated if they feel achievement, if they feel success on something. So what's the best way we can get them to kind of feel success? And then how can we add compound interest on that? How can we kind of get them to then ultimately be okay, so here's another thing, Drew, which I think you'll be interested in. Everybody wants kids to be doing inquiry learning or discovery-based learning or project-based learning, and there's a big difference, as you often say, between those terms. It's just there's different views about how to get there.
Right.
So in cognitive load theory, the expertise reversal effect is very explicit and clear that direct instruction is a bad thing if you're teaching people who have a lot of knowledge. It's very clear about that. It says there's a diminishing return with explicit instruction. What ultimately you need to do is to hand off control to the learner so that they will ultimately be working independently. And there you have crossover with people like Bruner from the 1960s. Bruner was wrong about things, I think, but he was also right about some things too, and that's why we included him in our book. He's an arch constructivist, but we included him. We included other figures that we felt were important voices, but even Piaget. Piaget is really the godfather of constructivism, but he was wrong, I think, in terms of the idea that you can only learn things by being actively engaged in it, which is true and not true at the same time. And that if somebody teaches somebody something, they're depriving them of learning it themselves. That, I think, is a corrosive idea. That it's just palpably not true. I mean, if that were the case, then we would never be inspired by someone giving a speech or playing a song or reading a poem or anything like that. But he was right about I think where he's really interesting is his work on schema theory, assimilation, accommodation. They're really important terms, I think. So there's a lot of convergence, but where the divergence happens is in the method. And they're good kind of conversations you can have, I think.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you mentioned, memory and the use of the definition of learning is a change in long-term memory or something like that, which seems obviously true, but is, I think, the way you're articulating it, tell me if you agree, is learning is that and much more.
Right.
And when I hear people talk that science of learning talk, I hear them and think, okay, so yes, and it's really, to me, there's two things that strike me as fundamental distinctions that we should be making. One, which is what are the academic outcomes that we're after, and then how important is efficiency. And one of the things that I think is a real problem I see with the sort of evangelists of science of learning is that the list of acceptable outcomes, or the things that they are pointing at, are that long-term memory change seem to be very narrow. Now, I say that with what I think, I actually don't think that's true, right? I think the way that they talk about it leaves that perception, but one of the things that I think has got to be true is that, of course, they don't want to just be left at surface learning and surface knowledge. That would be absurd, right? That would, no real professional educator thinks, well, all they need to know is a list of facts, right?
Yeah.
But the way that the conversation unfolds and the questions about what are the acceptable outcomes, what are you pointing at, seem to be so narrow that it's like we can't even have the same conversation.
Yeah, that's a fair point, I think. So a big debate, say, between what we'll call constructivist methods and what you're talking about, science of learning, is assessment. And if you have students doing the kind of open-ended tasks, and you mentioned earlier how it's very hard to set that up right and get it right. The other problem is it's very difficult to assess that work, or it's very kind of subjective. Whereas, let's take something like learning to read, for example. It's relatively straightforward to test. And my daughter's just done a very controversial thing, which is a baseline phonics test. She did that yesterday, and my response to that is to not. Although I'm evangelist is not a word I'd ever use for myself, but I've been obsessed with the science of reading, and I've read so much about that field, and I just blown away by the utility of it and the transformational effect on teaching kids to read, and how it's so powerful. But my thing with my daughter is, well, that's the teacher's job. My job is to make her enjoy reading. So I read her Roald Dahl every night in a way that I try to make it as powerful and as interesting, and just to get her interested in books and the idea of a character in a novel and narrative and those things. So, but those things are hard to measure. They're important, but they're difficult to measure. And for educators in the school with very limited time, all those things are obviously really important, but if you want to get the most bang for your buck, what's the thing that's going to send my daughter? Yes, it's going to be inspiration and experiences, and I want her to have all those things, but I want her to learn how to read. Like, that's a really important thing. I want her to learn how to, add numbers, long division, all that kind of stuff. But you're right. Those narrow definitions of learning, and that's Paul's line, by the way. Yeah, Paul wrote that. It's in a paper with other people, but he wrote that. And I think you're right. It's self-evidently true, but of course there are things that sit on top of that. We always need to, when you're dealing with kids who are upset or whatever, you don't need cognitive load theory. You need to be a human being. You need to, put that to one side and go, this is a person that needs help, and I'm going to help them.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned Dylan earlier, Dylan William, who I had on this podcast fairly recently. We had a great conversation, and he mentioned how he changed his mind about cognitive load theory. But one of the quotes one of the things he said was that, yes, there is a matter of efficiency and learning some of these things, science of learning kinds of things, but there's also an issue of whether you say engagement, which we talk about behavioral and cognitive engagement, and one could say affective or emotional engagement as well. But how do you engage students outside of just that sort of knowledge building process with the recognition? And I think it's it's a caricature and a straw man of sorts that people say, well, direct instruction is just drill and kill or sit and spit, is one I've heard recently, which I thought that was a pretty graphic way to say it. But direct instruction, more traditional instruction, actually can be engaging. It's not necessarily engaging, neither is project-based learning, but that we do need to recognize and really think about how we're engaging and making that work important. Because I take your point, and Paul makes this point as well, is that being successful is a motivating factor, but there are also some other things at play there. When you're thinking about how, and I don't know if you do this in your role or to the extent that you do, thinking about how you sort of counsel or tell teachers, like, when you're planning a lesson or a unit or extended lesson or something like that, what's the process that you recommend for just a sort of the basic planning process?
So the first thing to say is we're trying to get kids to be interested in things that they're not interested in. That's just the very first thing. And pretending that kids are interested in quadratic equations, or they're interested in it if it's received in a particular way. They're certainly not interested in reading. I mean, my daughter was so resistant to it when she first started maths. She was terrified of maths. It wasn't until it was explained to her explicitly how it works, and then she practiced it, that she gained confidence. But so that's the first thing. So what are the best ways of doing that? And like you say, it's not all going to be retrieval practice, or there's that there's an element of how do you get people interested in things or how do you get people to see things in a way that they've never seen them before. So take something like Shakespeare, for example, which I taught for years. I didn't even like it till I went to university. And I'd been reading voraciously as a kid. But the underlying narrative, the meaning, the character struggles, the common themes, what is ambition, what is love, what do you do, how do you confront death, all of those things are things that are common to everybody. And that's the door you can open to get people thinking and draw them in. And likewise in science, there's similar kind of hinge concepts and other things. But really, in terms of planning, curriculum is number one. So you have to be explicit about what do you want them to know. And then I think you need to build in instruction around that. And also, I would say an important thing to think about then, there's three things. There's curriculum, there's what we're teaching, there's how we're teaching in pedagogy, and then there's assessment. Those three things. And I think that if you just think about those three things and how they interact and how they work together, and do it in a way that's informed by, we have a lot of evidence about how to do those things at a very, efficient is an unfortunate word, but at an effective level, shall we say. But like you say, like the most well-designed curriculum, behavior is another big challenge. What's the culture of the school?
Right.
Like that's nothing to do with any of the things we're talking about. If the culture of the school is horrific and there's no respect for each other, for teaching, for the subject itself, then that's probably something you want to address before you talk about, any other stuff. So there's all those other things. But I think those three, they're the big three for me. Yeah. Think about those things, like voraciously attend to them, and it's hard to go wrong, I think.
So the way that I talk about it, especially more recently, and I'm curious to get your take on this, and I like the way that Hattie talks about surface deepened transfer. I think that's an easily digestible way. You can talk about depths of knowledge. You can use other frameworks, but just intuitively, I think surface deepened transfer is easy to use as a framework. And so we think, okay, so we want to. What do we want out of our teaching and learning, or the education process? I think we want students to be engaged, both cognitively and behaviorally. We want them to think about things in ways that we want them to think, and we want them to learn things that we want them to learn. Now, you pull those things apart, right? Especially, what do we want them to think, and how do we want them to think? And that gets to both the thinking and learning get to the outcomes piece, right? Because if you say, I want them to do some surface learning and also be engaged in deeper learning and transfer, and how not just ill-conceived problems, but open-ended problems, and wrestling with ideas that maybe don't have a right answer or might have a variety of answers, because it's a social studies kind of curriculum versus more math or science, which might be more sort of yes or no closed-ended questions. And so I say, well, then we want to align our instruction accordingly. The instructional approach should be, aligned with that academic outcome, and it's not quite as neat as putting it into those boxes, of course, but that we want to really be thoughtful about that, and efficiency can be really important. I mean, we were talking about this last week at the school where I was working, and it was an inquiry workshop, but I'm saying if you want to be efficient, then by all means use direct or explicit instruction here. But there are times when efficiency may not be your top priority. That's not for me to decide. You're a school. You've got to make those instructional decisions. I would certainly give you some advice in some of those areas. But that there are times when you might want them to wrestle with things a little bit more and not have the answers so easily accessible. I know productive struggle is something that just gets, that's a horse to be beat on. So I'm curious, just as I described that there, that you would use a mix of direct or explicit instruction, inquiry exercises, and collaborative activities to meet those instructional outcomes, academic outcomes, as desired and as sort of aligned.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's what I think about this, and I'll bounce this right back at you and see what you think about this. But I think when I hear you talk about inquiry, to me, you're talking about a spirit or like a philosophical, like a way of coming to learning, like and what, like when inquiry makes sense to me, it's posited in that way. The paradox with it is that to get to a final outcome, sometimes you need to do the opposite of the final outcome to get to that intended outcome. And inquiry really is very consistent with, as I mentioned before, in cognitive load theory. And so is constructivism. I mean, in the field, if we think about that cognitive revolution in the 50s and 60s, all those guys, Ausubel, they were talking about the idea of meaning. The underlying meaning is what's important, not facts or figures, or they're just the incidental components. So to me, inquiry means a spirit of attending to a domain of knowledge or a field that we would want everyone to have. That sort of, okay, I'm going to ask questions about this, and those questions will lead to other questions, and it's very much dialogic in nature. It's the meaning is to be found in the interstitial. It's to be found in the interaction between two things, rather than this is the way it is.
Yeah.
It's always about updating and two people talking, and so that to me is one thing where my point would be, and this isn't me talking about inquiry. I'm talking about things where you have, for example, say we want kids to follow their own interests and do what they're just want to do. If I had done that when I was at school, I would never have encountered the Odyssey. I would never have encountered James Joyce. I never would have encountered things that changed my life.
Yeah.
I would still be sitting around playing with Star Wars figures, or that's what I would be doing.
Yeah.
Surely our job as educators is to introduce kids to brave new worlds. And to me, that's where, if I'm looking at something like inquiry-based learning with the most charitable lens that I can, I would say that is something that everybody wants to achieve. We all want to come at knowledge with an inquiry mindset and think about it with questions and all that kind of thing. So, and the other thing about direct instruction is probably the worst. Like whoever came up with the term as a marketing strategy, well, it was Siegfried Engelmann. I think I'm right in saying, I think I heard someone say that recently. Direct instruction is the most, when I read the research, starting with, Project Follow Through in the 60s, and I bought his book to teach my daughter how to read. And it is the most incredible thing. And it's the most interactive thing, and it's the most engaging thing, and it's the most inquiry-based thing you could think of. It's the opposite of a kind of boring lecture droning on. And then even something like explicit instruction, the book, by Hollingsworth and Ybarra, that's even more kind of engaged, cognitively engagement. But to go back, just one last point about engagement is this thing of like, well, yeah, as you know, I've spoken a lot about engagement as Rob Coe calls it, a poor proxy indicator for learning. But if we're only going to go off the little, what kids are interested in, we're doing them a great disservice. And this is where it becomes an equity issue.
Mm-hmm.
Our job isn't to follow their interests. Our job is to expand their interests and go, this is a great thing that was once said by this person, or here's a historical thing that happened, and then get them to maybe think and ask questions. So, yeah, in a roundabout way, I think I would agree with you. And ultimately, with the science of learning, we all want kids to be working independently, working on projects or whatever it is. We all want them to be doing that.
Right.
We just would probably say, here's one way of doing it, and it wouldn't be direct or explicit instruction all the time. That would be ridiculous.
Yeah, I think your point, and I say this often here on the podcast, sometimes in writing, often in workshops, because people will ask about inquiry, and they will say things like, oh, because in our project-based learning model, one of the elements is autonomy, which means if that's something that's important, then again, we got to turn that knob up to 11, and we're not supposed to actually teach. And so absolutely not. Inquiry, I mean, part of the problem with inquiry is that it's really hard to quantify. Like you said, it's just sort of a spirit or a vibe, or there are different ways it can look and it can manifest, whereas the more traditional instruction is much more easily quantifiable, and the results tend to be as well. And that is a problem, one, in the conversation, and two, because some of the conversation partners just lose their mind when you say you can't easily define it. But yes, we want to make sure, and it is really about that guidance level, right? It's how much and when are they ready for inquiry, and what's the level of guidance and scaffolding that they might need in order to do it or do it well. And I also think it's important for people on that end, that school, that inquiry constructivist school, to recognize that, as you say, direct or explicit instruction, when done well, is not this caricature, drill and kill, sit and spit kind of thing. That's done poorly, just like inquiry can be done poorly. And the way that you talk about it is what I mean, you're really like, I'm in my head sort of, clapping, because like, I think that there's significant overlap between what I'm advocating for and what many of the science of learning folks are advocating for. But there's a sort of different language and a messaging, and it's like, can we acknowledge that inquiry is actually a good thing? Inquiry done poorly is a really bad thing, and that it's okay to make that distinction, right? But we're in such a tribal landscape that is seemingly impossible. Somebody that I am quite fond of, and I think her work is really great, and I'm sure you know, Catherine Burbelsing. She's been on the podcast some time ago. We were messaging on WhatsApp today, and she literally said, and I hope she doesn't mind me sharing this, because she's obviously quite public, but she's like, you think basically the way she characterizes my view of what she does there at Michaela is that it's not inquiry and it's not good for kids, and it couldn't be further from the truth. I think she's probably doing great work, and I would love to come see her school, but my guess is that she's doing loads of inquiry and loads of great discussion and those kinds of things. But the message that I hear from that sort of set, and I could give other names that I won't, is that inquiry is bad. And it's like, how do we find the middle of that Venn diagram? Because
so the thing there, Drew, is what those people are thinking is they're thinking minimally guided instruction.
Right, discovery learning.
Yeah. So they're thinking that, I mean, if you want to learn anything, and particularly something that's complex, and particularly something that's, what Geary would call biologically secondary knowledge, there's two ways we can learn it, and this is Sweller's idea as well. We are evolutionarily primed to learn from an expert as novices. That's just a really remarkable feature of human beings. We can learn from each other in a way at a really complex level.
Yeah.
And to try to figure out yourself through means ends analysis is just a really bad way of doing things. But where I think you could sort of and again, thinking about inquiry, I think to kind of front load it with, well, that's not what we're saying. That's what I'm hearing that you're saying. You're saying this is a way of coming at with irreverence, a sort of a respect for a domain of knowledge, and saying we're going to ask questions. We're going to begin with questions about things. How does this work? Or that's a kind of again, you might call it knowledge rich as well, to really.
It should be, yes.
Cross the wires.
It's exactly
so
right.
I think that's probably where people will. You're probably going to get more convergence.
Yeah, well, Ron Richard in his most recent book made a distinction that I thought was maybe useful, is distinguishing between informational learning and transformational learning.
Sure.
And I think that distinction is one what we really should investigate a bit more and talk a bit more about, right? Because yes, inquiry should be really knowledge rich. And one of the things that I emphasize is that we need to build the capacity and skill in students and learners who will then become adults to frame things with frame problems with questions. Like, what do I need to know and learn in order to do this and do this well? And that takes modeling, that takes practice, and that's why we really emphasize that in our project-based learning work, which is, what are the academic outcomes, content standards and those kinds of things. Turn them into questions, use your driving question, and then how do you pull them out from the students with your facilitative help, sometimes more manipulatively than others, to identify, hey, these are the things we need to know and learn in order to do this. Because when they get to be adults and buying a home or whatever, that they need to have that, because nobody's going to be there to give them direct instruction on that. Or if they do, they might, buying a home, they'll tell you can afford this house, and maybe that's not true. So that's why I think that process, yes, we really need knowledge, and you do need knowledge to do critical thinking with. That is a misnomer that some folks will say, oh, you can just Google it. That's not a useful way to think about things. Yes, you can Google things, but there's the fluency and having that knowledge base. Not to mention, there's a cultural connection that E.D. Hirsch would talk about, then I think that's important as well. But we're saying, all right, how do we build not just that knowledge, but that inquiry skill through the practice that doesn't necessarily happen. It's not evident. It's not something that you can quantify right away. It's a skill that builds over time, and maybe even crystallizes in adult years because you've been able to practice that over years, whereas long-term memory change is something you can measure quickly.
Yeah, that's true. But then long-term memory change is also the thing that we were talking about there. It's also that change in adulthood. And if you didn't have a lot of that stuff that you were taught in whatever way, I mean, all of that is I think in education there's sometimes a moment where certain educators, and again, you sound very sensible to me. Certain educators sound to me a little bit like Deepak Chopra, or it sounds a bit woo-woo-ish. It turns into, I mean, a good example there is, of course, that statement is true: informational learning versus transformational learning. But at the same time, then I think, well, let's take that 5-year-old. Let's take my daughter learning to read. She's learning a lot of information, like this is the sound of these two. This is what the digraph sounds like. There's a lot of information, but it's unbelievably transformational. She can now read. She can now read a book. I mean, it just blows my mind. Every time I see my daughter read a sentence, I almost burst out in tears. I'm almost like, my God, this is magic, and that is transformational. But it is about her long-term memory has changed. That's just a fact. And it's I think there's an element of it in education where people they don't like talking about this stuff in the clinical way. That's where the science of learning is people are so resistant to it, because they want to keep it in that woo-woo-ish type of, stuff. And again, that's not the work you're doing. I'm really thinking about people who kind of say, well, what matters is the feelings of the student, or what they think they are, or all those kind of things. Whereas, I mean, another example is just having clear boundaries for kids, or having, those things are really important. And I guess, there is a lot of overlap, and maybe, your work, Drew, you can be the man to draw those connections.
Yeah, well, I'm trying, but no, I think your point about the informational leading to transformational is a really important one. We can't overlook the importance of one for the other, and they are really connected in ways, and that is sort of central to what I believe. And I also think, just to sort of further your point, is that there are, and I'm quite skeptical and critical of folks of, sort of the deeper learning crowd, that it's like, okay, is this TikTok worthy, or are they actually learning something? And, we've got to make sure it can be TikTok worthy. That's not necessarily a problem, but it's a problem if they get to the end of a project-based learning experience or an inquiry exercise or whatever, and they haven't learned anything, or especially haven't learned the things that we want them to learn. And coupled with that, the idea that, we should always let students sort of direct all of the learning. There's, I think, a role and a time and place for some of that, and their questions can be a guide and can be really helpful. But one of the things that I talk about with our project-based learning work is people will say, well, can't we have kids come up with a driving question? I said, well, you might be able to get away with that, but the danger is that you create this driving question in a project, and you get to the end, and the cognitive path that you needed them to travel was not, you weren't anywhere close to that path. And so you get to the end and say, oh, what kind of fun things and great things did they learn? Not, did they learn the things that we wanted them to learn? And that, to me, is a real problem. So
I completely agree with that. And that stuff about let the kids come up with the questions, that's the kind of thing where that's where the pushback comes from, because that's just insane. I mean, that is just like, you wouldn't do that in any other field of, if you were learning to be a dentist, or if you're learning to drive a car, you wouldn't have someone get in the car and go, oh, what does this do? You go ahead and, figure it out. So yeah, just listen to you there, Drew. It sounds to me like you'd almost kind of, because that's very sensible what you're saying there about I like that, the cognitive flight path, or whatever that phrase.
Path,
that makes a lot of sense. And that almost is like I don't know, it's almost like, I'm trying to think of it like instructional inquiry or something. You could see somebody coming up with a new kind of term that kind of pulls a lot of the elements together and makes it, kind of sensible. Because if someone was to say to me, okay, inquiry learning is this, it's not students come up with the questions, it's the expert coming up with the questions for novices, but the spirit is one of inquiry, the spirit is one of driving questions. That would make sense to me. But like you say, that stuff of, hey, let the kid come up with the questions, and the ultimate, the assessment will be a TikTok video.
Right.
I mean, that's yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, an assessment could be a TikTok video if we're assessing their ability to perform or put together a TikTok video.
Yeah.
I always say, if you're going to assess, like in project-based learning, we have presentations or products like that. That's not a good place to assess their informational learning, their knowledge. You want to do that individually, and you can use much more traditional methods for that, and then use the project to assess. And we would want some knowledge fluency and things like that. But
the presentation stuff is really important as well, Drew, because that's there's intangible stuff there that's important, such as preparing them for being able to speak publicly, and being able to there's stuff that you're not going to put a grade or a letter on, but they're really important too.
And we want to embed the instructional approach as appropriate. So, like my daughter, when she was in 5th grade, her teacher, she's the only one that ever took me up on this, to come in and do a project-based learning experience. And I've written about it on our blog. It wasn't the greatest project. It was a brand new teacher, and, I wasn't herding her like a sheepdog. Certainly lots of things that I would have done differently if I were running the classroom, but I co-taught a little bit. It was to create a tipping guide for the local pizza place, and one of those things we had to learn, and this is the content, part of the content, was how to multiply multi-digit decimals. And so we identified that as a need to know, and then you connect your teaching to it and say, okay, we're going to work on the next 3 days teaching you how to do that, which looked a lot like direct instruction, and there's worksheets and practice and, some of the things that you would be familiar with in the sort of science of learning crowd. And then you take that and how do you, expound upon it. A teacher in one of my recent workshops, he mentioned, I think he said, he had a military background, and he said, direct and explicit instruction or knowledge building is like the regular infantry of an army, and inquiry is like the special forces. It has like a multiplier effect. And I thought it's a really interesting way to think about it. But of course, there's ways to do that really, really poorly. So one thing, and feel free to comment on any of that, but I know we're running a little bit long here. One thing that I am really, you mentioned earlier, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say anything about it or have you say anything about it. You mentioned learning styles, right? That's a myth, and man, does that get lots of traction and posts on the social media, right?
Sure.
So when I talk with teachers, I say, learning styles is a myth, and I do dispel that. But we talk about sometimes learning preferences, and I had a chance to talk to Howard Gardner about a different book, but I had asked him about that. I mean, certainly seems true that there's sort of multiple intelligences, the way that people sort of process information, have strengths and things like that, and that we have a preference in how we intake information. I might watch a YouTube video tutorial, that kind of thing, but that's not to say that we should that we should design our instruction to meet all those Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences and do something visual spatial and something like that. How do you talk to teachers about learning styles outside of just saying, hey, it's a myth?
Yeah, I think you've always got to be careful, because there are people who, everybody has different preferences for food. Mm-hmm. People like pizza, people like salads, whatever. But the basic effect of eating sugar every day for 2 months is common to almost everybody. Mm-hmm. And the generalized effect of eating a balanced, fiber-rich protein or balanced meal and cutting out the sugar and synthetics and stuff, for 99% of people, the outcome is going to be one way. So the multiple intelligences stuff is, well, the evidence on that is, again, I think it was not Bruner. I think it was I'll look it up, I'll find it out, but it was described by one famous academic as useful fictions. And I think the learning styles, if it were true, then it's very easily testable. Mm-hmm. And it has been tested. The Pashler reviews is a really good one. And obviously people do have preferences, and people have preferences for food too. And kids are, God knows I suffer with my own kids and when they're eating, what they will eat and what they won't eat. But I know as an adult that when my daughter says that she wants to have candy for breakfast or whatever it is, mm-hmm. it's not going to, the long-term effects of that are not going to be great. So there's this discrepancy between short-term effects and long-term effects. And I think the learning style stuff is just, it's damaging because A, it's not true, but B, even if it were true, it's an impossible way to do the job, because you're talking about planning 3 and 4 different lessons for every one. Right. So, like if you're like planning a meal for your you're planning a meal for 30 people, and the objective is not so much that they'll the objective is that they will enjoy it, but also that they'll have long-term health, then you're probably going to design something that's going to be tasty but also nutritious and whatnot. So if you were just going, well, I'll just go with everyone's each individual preferences, then the outcome is going to be the same. But the evidence, again, things are true whether we want it to be true or not. And learning styles has been tested, and there are things that are contentious in education, and the debate's worth having. That's at the very far end of the scale. Right. That's one thing where that's one thing where that's been settled a long time ago. And I did this thing, Drew, where I was talking to, this is like a few years ago, I was talking to some teachers in Sweden, and someone asked me about learning styles, and I said, diplomatically, well, there's not very much evidence to support it. And if you think about it, if you were teaching someone about the continent of Africa, does that mean for the auditory learners you need to record an audio book or you need to explain the map, or does that mean for the content determines the pedagogy? So if you're teaching something, you look at what's going to be the best way of teaching that rather than what's their preference. And this one teacher said, oh no, I learning style, I've been using it for years and it works really well for me, and I've seen the research on it and stuff. And that's then you're up against someone who's a kind of it's like talking to a conspiracy theorist or something. But again, I don't think there's much to be gained from telling people they're wrong. And you've got to try and draw people in and kind of appeal to their what they want to do and do it that way, because the evidence is always changing. So well, it's helpful.
It seems to me it's just one of those things that people say anymore. Like they don't really think much about it. They just say it because they seem to think it's true and they've heard it so many times. And if you press them on it, well, what does that mean? How do you do that? They probably wouldn't go to the depths that your conversation partner mentioned. But I will say the meal analogy, as a father of older kids and you've got younger kids, one mistake that I've made, at least my perception, is that I didn't make them or get them to eat a variety of different foods. So I have been remiss that I've been a short order cook in many ways, and I have been making lots of different meals. So my advice to you is train them early on that, right?
I know, yeah.
So you're not making 10 different meals.
I think we've already lost the battle there, Drew, which I'm a short order cook. I always say to my wife, with the 3 small kids, it's like we're busy waiters in the most busiest restaurant in the world with the worst customers in the world.
Yeah, well, anyways, so the book, How Learning Happens, there's an update. How Teaching Happens. You're working on a new one, you said. What else?
So Paul and I are writing with Jim again, and with a brilliant colleague called Pete van der Plug at Academic University. We're writing a book called, at the minute, it's called The Instructional Paradox. I touched on it earlier, but a series of things about learning and teaching that are paradoxical, the opposite of what I think you need to do. So we're working on that at the minute. Yeah, fascinating.
Well, we'll put links to both the books. Are they updates? They're online, right?
Right. Yeah, they're all. Yeah, the second edition is online. Yeah.
Okay. We'll make sure to put those in the show notes. Any other places? I'll put your Twitter/X because you love social media so much. Any other things that you'd like to make sure people hear or are aware of?
No, that's it really. I'm trying to keep. I'm the only thing I'm on. I think I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on X, Twitter, and that's enough for me. And I really, if I could get rid of it, I would.
Yeah, it's hard to break that habit for sure.
Yeah.
Well, Carl, it's been a real pleasure talking. I appreciate the work that you do and the conversation that we had, and hope to have more in the future.
Great conversation, Drew. Thank you so much.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.